Hello, fellow nerds. So let's talk today about political developments in classical China. You are going to identify major political developments in China during the classical period, and you're going to take notes on the packet that you got in class on these political developments. So first of all, you're probably wondering, what precisely is backwards? A development is a change. So again, development is a change, and a political development means that it's a change in government, specifically, as opposed to, for example, social developments, which we'll get to later. Political developments, this could be a change in the leadership. When Barack Obama became the first black president in the United States, that was an American political development. Change in the system of government, a revolution such as the one that you'll learn about later in Russia, that happened when communists took over. That's a political development as well. The philosophy behind a government shifting, changing, would also be a political development. And finally, if institutions are created or destroyed, such as a bureaucracy in China, that could be a political development as well. For examples, as we said, if a new ruler takes power, perhaps there's a civil war between rival political units. If there's a change in the way that the rulers hold power, you'll see this when we get, for instance, to ancient Rome and how we shift between republic and essentially a dictatorship. And then an overthrow of the government in rebellion, as I mentioned before, with the Russian Revolution when communists take power in the early 1900s. As I said, also the philosophy about how to run a government, if that changes, then that would also be a political development. However, goods exchange between two merchants, that's not a political development, that is an economic development because it's about trade. And arguably, it's not even a development if it's just about goods being exchanged, but either way, it is not political, it is economic. A new religion being founded is not a political development either, it is instead a social development. So again, we have all these examples on the left which are political because they deal with government, and items on the right are not political because they deal in the first case with the economics and in the second with society, so they're social development. Or maybe so we're talking about China today. It is, as you can see, we're in what's called the classical period from about 1200 BCE to 250 BCE. So if you notice, after the Zhou dynasty, we have Confucius and Lao Tzu, who founds Taoism, and all this is the period of the 100 philosophies during the Warring States period, when there was multiple different philosophers trying to figure out how should China proceed going forward. Should we have 5 relationships that dictate the future, as in Confucianism, or should we, in a sense, almost not even have government to get in the way of the natural order of things, as in Taoism? Or there are others, such as legalism, that we'll get to. Later on, we get to the Qin dynasty, where China gets its name, and the Great Wall begins. The Han, which lasts right around the same time as the Roman Empire, and then we will go from there. This dynastic cycle, which, again, a dynasty is a family of kings, the idea being that when one ruler dies, succession, the power gets passed down to usually his son, but it stays within the family. And then you would refer to the dynasty by the family name. So, for instance, the Han dynasty is within a particular family versus the Zhou dynasty from a different family. The mandate of heaven is what justifies the dynastic cycle, the shift between new and old dynasties. Rather than me tell you more about it, you are going to write about it on the final page of your notes packet, where it says 2, consider the diagram below and respond to the following questions. How is the mandate of heaven actually democratic? If you think deeply about this question, you might realize that even though the Chinese would say the right to rule comes from the gods, when you consider the actual cycle, there might be a little bit more at play in terms of how people had power in this system.
Tonight we're going to talk about the classical dynasties of China, specifically their political developments. So the Zhou is the first dynasty. It lasted for just under 800 years. However, the Zhao dynasty wasn't thriving throughout that entire time. It was a ruling depending on who you asked. And there was some period of discontent and instability during that time. Next, you have the Qin dynasty that ruled from 221 to 202 BCE, so only 19 years. It only had one ruler who was quite brutal, and then he was overthrown by the peasants who started the Han dynasty. And that dynasty lasted for a little over 400 years. You can see on the timeline. So the Zhao dynasty is first. It had weak central rule. It relied on alliances with regional princes. So it was very similar to the Shang in that way. Decentralized, not clearly authoritative. The Zhao, though, did carry out the feat of expanding its territory to include the Middle Kingdom, which is rich cropland. And if you can visualize China, it means they went south and towards the sea, towards Vietnam, etc. The regional princes, though, disregarded central power. They often did what they wanted, didn't listen to the emperor, and the dynasty ends up falling. They lose the mandate of heaven. So here you can see China in the Shang and the Zhao eras. And you can see down south near the Yangtze River is where the Middle Kingdom is. And so the Shang dynasty is in the green, and the Zhao dynasty is that red outline. It's orange. Next is the Qin, who takes power. Shi Huangdi is very famous. He only ruled for 19 years. He died, but he was very effective, though he used brutality to do so. So that when we talk about how do governments keep control, he did it through brutal forces. He was able to centralize power after the Zhao had a breakdown. He started a census throughout the entire empire. He had a better idea of resources, so he could spread out the money, spread out the food, because he knew where the people were crowded. He was able to extend the borders of China to include Hong Kong and northern Vietnam, so he almost doubles the size of China in those 19 years. And Shi Huangdi is responsible for beginning the building of the Great Wall. He wanted to defend the northern borders. However, to do this, he had to rely heavily on coerced labor to complete the project. Coerced meaning forced. Think slavery. A lot of people fell inside the two walls and died and were just buried there because they couldn't be saved. So high death toll during the building of the Great Wall. And his death resulted in the fall of the Qin dynasty. No one wanted to continue his dynasty's legacy because he was so brutal. Han dynasty steps up when he dies, and it's led by peasant revolts. So the Han dynasty has small origins, but they lessen the brutality, but they maintain the centralized government. So they keep some aspects of Shi Huangdi's changes, but the Han dynasty, as you can see, because it lasts over 400 years, establishes a more sustainable way of ruling. Wu Ti is the most famous Han emperor, and he expands territory. He creates an examination system for bureaucrats. So he follows Confucius' ideas that government officials should be educated. They should earn their right to serve in the government, not just know somebody. So he encouraged the adoption of Confucian ideals and practices. So this is very different from the Qin, who used legalism and disagreed with Confucianism. So this means we value hard work, merit, education. So there's a movement towards a meritocracy, which means you earn your position. And so some lower class people who the upper class saw as having potential, the upper class might fund them taking the civil service exam, and they might be able to move up the ladder and serve in the government. In the classical era, this is very rare for peasants to be able to move up. Eventually, the Han dynasty falls to outside invasions, but again, after 400 years. So think of our cycle and what problems cause dynasties to lose the mandate of heaven. And you can see how much the territory expands under the Han, and that northern border is where the Great Wall is. You can see it drawn along the zigzag line labeled Great Wall. So China's political framework, at the core of everything and what keeps people in line, is the family structure. It's patriarchal, the men are in charge, and there's an emphasis on authority, listening to your elders, and you've practiced ancestor worship. The worst thing you can do is embarrass your ancestors. So that is the key point that keeps people in order. Next, you have local political units who have village leaders who are in charge of regulating property, coordinating the farming so that everyone gets fed. The landowning nobles organize the military troops and courts of justice. But again, a lot of the work is done for them because of the strict family structure. And then at the very top is the central government. The central government had a single law code, uniform taxes. They appointed governors with military and legal power in the name of the emperor. So they had experience. They had to pass that civil service exam. And so it's a very centralized government. So about our centralized government, the ruler establishes the centralized codes, appoints officials of his choosing who have passed the civil service exam. So the idea is that they are deserving of it. Decisions are made by the ruler, carried out by his officials. That's one of the trademarks, hallmarks of a bureaucracy. So the ruler doesn't go around enforcing the law, his officials do. Ruler sets the tax amount and the officials collect it. Taxes. But centralized government means the end of reliance on arrangements with local governments, meaning if the local governments aren't happy, so what? Doesn't matter. So this is what caused the downfall of the Zhao. So the Qin and Han emperors tried to learn from those mistakes. No downfall, no good. So the bureaucracy, this is this abstract idea that we're going to talk about throughout the year. The bureaucracy consists of government officials, people who work in the government, and you had to pass an exam based on Confucian teachings and Chinese literature, so you had to be educated. You didn't just need to be wealthy. And so the purpose is to promote the idea of a scholar bureaucrat. So a government worker who's educated to do a good job. This is one of Confucius's key ideals, is that workers are educated, and those who rule should be educated so that people will respect them. And some individuals of lower rank were recruited to take the test. So this is the exception, not the rule. So more frequently, it did stay among the nobles who had better access to education, etc. But there were some lower class citizens who were able to move up, thanks to this meritocracy system. So now go ahead and complete the guiding questions on your own with the independent practice. This Venn diagram and then the question on the back.